Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are tackling something that is, well, it's one of the most stubborn, most pervasive, and frankly most destructive cultural beliefs in the modern world.
It really
We're
is.
talking about the core American ideal that success comes only from individual grit. Tireless effort, the myth of pulling yourself up by your bootstrap.
The bootstraps myth, it's everywhere.
It is. And, most of us, if we really stop and think about it for a second, we know life is more complicated than that. Nobody truly succeeds all by themselves.
Right.
But this idea of rugged, radical individualism, it carries this immense emotional and intellectual weight in our society. Our sources for this deep dive show how this obsession with individual striving can turn very quickly into what one writer called a nationwide bullying of the poor.
That's a powerful way to put it.
And it results in this deep cultural shame, a lot of self-blame, and just public condemnation for anyone who doesn't, achieve the status of a victor.
Exactly. And that's really our mission today. This is an investigation into the machinery behind that narrative. How did this self-made myth get so deeply, deeply entrenched in the American psyche?
Right.
We're not just looking at the philosophical origins of the idea, we're looking at the consequences. And crucially, we're going to try to shift the focus away from these perceived individual failings.
The idea that poverty is just a bad mindset or making poor choices.
Yes. That's the story we're always told. Instead, we're going to investigate the structural realities.
Okay.
So today is really a study in contrast. We're going to document the intense moral scrutiny. I mean, it often borders on humiliation that's placed on the poor,
And then contrast that with what?
with the vast and often completely invisible subsidies, the loopholes, the corporate welfare that's received by the wealthy and by major corporations.
Yeah.
We're going to try to make the invisible visible.
And in doing that, understand why structural economic failure is so often disguised as personal moral failure.
That's the goal.
Okay, let's unpack this. And to really understand the current state of blame, I think we have to start right at the beginning. We have to look at the cultural architects who first built this whole framework of self-reliance. When we talk about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, I think most of us assume that phrase has been around forever, since the founding of the country.
It feels ancient, doesn't it? Like it's baked into the Declaration of Independence or something.
But it's not. Our sources actually pinpoint the emergence of that phrase and also self-made man to a really specific and kind of surprising historical moment, the 1830s.
And that specific timing is just, it's foundational to understanding this whole myth. You have to ask, what was happening in the 1830s in America?
A lot. It was a period of massive industrial expansion, right?
Okay.
Railroads, steamboats.
Rapid technological change, incredible entrepreneurial activity, yes. But it was also a moment of widening social inequality and
Yeah.
just intense labor exploitation, including, and we can't forget this, chattel slavery.
So the story emerges just as the gap between rich and poor is exploding.
Precisely. The self-made narrative emerges, in part, to serve a social function. It's there to legitimize those widening disparities.
It's a justification.
It's a tidy explanation. It gives the new industrialists a story for their success that doesn't rely on, exploiting other people or inheriting capital or benefiting from state policies. The story says, I earned this. I earned it purely through my superior choices and my ability.
Even if the whole structure around them was fundamentally rigged in their favor.
Socially then.
And this emphasis on radical, uncompromising individualism,
Yeah.
it's distinctly American, isn't it? We seem to be highly unusual in how much we value pure independence.
Oh, massively. If you look at many interdependent cultures, especially in East Asia, they tend to define people heavily in terms of their environment, their context, their relationships, their duties to society.
But the American value system,
It defines people almost entirely by internal attributes. Your choices, your abilities, your unique decisions. It's all on you.
which creates a kind of closed loop of judgment.
A perfect closed loop. If success is entirely because of your internal attributes, then failure must also be entirely because of your internal choices. A lack of effort, a lack of intelligence, or some kind of moral flaw.
And that closed loop becomes the core ideological script for the next 200 years. When you trace it forward, you find this rich vein of hypocrisy running right through its most famous figures.
Let's start with one of the most cited groups, the American Transcendentalists.
Right. Writers and thinkers in the early to mid-19th century, they championed individualism, the spiritual over the material, a deep connection to nature.
And their poster child is, of course, Henry David Thoreau. His time at Walden Pond is held up as the ultimate self-reliant experiment.
The story we all get is that he went to the woods, he built his own cabin, grew his own food, and lived completely free from the, quote, fetters of society.
Yeah.
But when you actually look closely at the details of that famous experiment, it's not quite what it seems. It's entirely dependent on hidden outside support.
It's an incredible image that's built on a hidden safety net. Thoreau wasn't living in the deep wilderness. He was on land owned by his friend Ralph Waldo Emerson.
And it wasn't that remote, right?
Not at all. It was just a mile and a half outside of Concord, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
And crucially, as our sources point out, his mother was reportedly doing his laundry and bringing him baked goods.
So much for rugged individualism.
He was also relying on the nearby town for tools and supplies. I mean, what he was doing was conducting an experiment in philosophical minimalism, which is interesting.
Yeah.
But it wasn't genuine radical self-sufficiency, not by a long shot.
That's a really important distinction. It's the difference between declaring independence from, say, the market economy versus declaring independence from the collective human need for interdependence.
Absolutely. And the hypocrisy just deepens when you get to the Horatio Alger stories.
Ah, yes. Ragged Dick. These books were hugely popular, and they're always cited as proof that young men could rise on pluck and hard work alone.
That's the catchphrase, pluck and hard work. But if you actually go back and analyze the plots of the 100-plus novels Alger wrote, you realize the central mechanism for success wasn't grit at all.
What was it then?
It was almost universally the same plot device. The poor, hardworking protagonist meets a wealthy, benevolent benefactor.
Ah.
And this benefactor then steps in, often with a large monetary gift or a job or access to high society.
So the ultimate story of the self-made man is actually a story about hidden patronage. It's a disguised transfer of wealth.
That is the irony. And to add to the uncomfortable moral foundation here, as our sources note, Alger himself was run out of his ministry early in his career for pedophilic acts.
Wow.
So the entire moral edifice of this pluck and luck narrative is deeply, deeply stained. And yet it remains foundational to the American idea of merit.
You jump forward a century from there, and you hit Ayn Rand. Her novels, Atlas Shrugged, The Fountainhead, they are still worshipped by wealthy technologists, by libertarian thinkers today. The whole ideology is that you must survive on your own terms, and any dependency is morally corrupting.
Yet Rand's own life provides the ultimate contradiction to her philosophy.
How so?
In her later years, after her philosophy had been widely spread, Rand became explicitly dependent on the very state systems that her ideology so vehemently rejected.
You mean?
She relied on Social Security and Medicare.
No way.
Yes, her inner circle apparently convinced her to accept these benefits, and they came up with this argument that they were merely deferred compensation for taxes she'd already paid, so it wasn't a handout.
That intellectual maneuvering is a perfect microcosm of the whole cultural denial, isn't it?
It's perfect.
The systems that are framed as vital and necessary for them, the wealthy, are simultaneously framed as parasitic and degrading for others, the poor.
Precisely. And look, the point of these biographical details isn't to personally judge Thoreau or Rand. The point is to expose the inescapable fact that nobody, not the hermit philosopher, not the fictional street urchin, and not the libertarian intellectual,
Yeah.
nobody lives an entirely independent life.
We are all interdependent.
Vulnerability, interdependence, reliance on collective structures, these are fundamental parts of the human condition, from the moment we are born until we require end-of-life care.
But the narrative of the self-made American goes beyond just authors. It's baked into our cultural history, too, often disguised as, quaint frontier life.
Yes.
We learn this lesson starting in childhood, often through stories like the Little House on the Prairie series.
That series is, in many ways, an example of incredibly powerful cultural propaganda for the self-reliance myth.
The Ingalls family.
Yes, the Ingalls family is depicted as surviving purely on sheer willpower, hard labor, and a refusal to give up. What is almost always left out of the cultural memory is the massive government subsidy they received.
They were beneficiaries of the Homestead Act of 1862. What exactly did that entail?
The Homestead Act was, you could argue, the biggest land giveaway in the country's history. It provided 160-acre parcels to applicants. All you had to do was file the right paperwork, live on the land for 5 years, and make some improvements.
So it was a massive injection of economic capital free land.
Free land. Provided overwhelmingly to white families who then used that asset base to build intergenerational wealth. The government was functionally just giving away an asset that the Ingalls family could sell or farm.
But hold on, isn't it true that a lot of homesteaders failed? They lost the land because the conditions were so harsh? Doesn't that prove that grit was still required and sort of softens the critique of the act?
But that doesn't soften the critique of the subsidy. Yes, farming was incredibly difficult, and many people failed. But those failures were individual business decisions. The fundamental economic fact remains that the initial capital, those 160 acres, was a free gift from the state.
It wasn't earned through labor or purchase.
No, it was a state subsidy, plain and simple, designed to incentivize settlement. And we have to connect this to the second deeper subsidy. That land was not, in fact, empty.
Right.
Its appropriation required the massive, violent displacement of the Kansa or Kaw peoples, who had been forcibly removed from their ancestral lands.
So the whole tradition of rugged independence, of the family making it on their own, was founded on two massive state actions.
Two, the unacknowledged subsidy of free land and the prior necessary violent removal of the indigenous occupants who had their own established claims to it.
So if we connect this all to the bigger picture, the entire tradition of the self-made man, from the 1830s entrepreneurs to the literary figures and the frontier settlers, it's fundamentally founded on hidden subsidies, inherited wealth, or some other kind of inborn privilege, which means that when affluent people succeed, we've already decided culturally that they are, quote, all too deserving their whole lives.
And that systemic denial of structural aid is what makes the intense blaming of the less fortunate possible. It allows successful people to believe that if they had obstacles, I was a teen mom, I had to save money, and they still made it, then the person who didn't make it is solely a product of their poor choices. It's just an exercise in profound denial of systemic advantage.
That denial leads us directly to the second part of this whole equation. Why do people, and I mean even people who aren't rich or who have struggled themselves, why do they find it so compelling to blame the poor? It turns out there are these deep psychological and intellectual tools that maintain this illusion of a fair playing field.
This is really where psychology meets ideology, specifically through something called the just world hypothesis, or JWH.
Okay.
It's a very strong, almost existential human need to believe that people generally get what they deserve, that there's some kind of moral bookkeeping in the universe.
Why do we need to believe that?
Well, the JWH exists because believing the world is fundamentally arbitrary and unfair is terrifying. It's destabilizing, and it's really hard to cope with.
So if we see someone suffering, our brain kind of runs a quick check to rationalize that suffering by assuming they must have done something wrong to deserve it.
Exactly. There's a classic psychological study on this in the 1960s. Students watched an actor who was pretending to receive painful electric shocks.
Okay.
The students had no information about why the actor was being shocked, but the longer the ordeal went on, the observing students started to assume the victim was a less pleasant or deserving person.
Had to downgrade the victim's character.
They had to, in order to maintain their own sense of cosmic order. And the same logic applies to wealth and poverty. The millionaire heir is automatically assumed to be a person of merit, of genius, of high integrity.
And conversely, the person struggling to find housing or work is, by definition, undeserving or ineligible for success.
It's an inherent cognitive twisting of the truth that allows us to cope with the unfairness of life without having to challenge the entire system.
And these cognitive biases are heavily used by elites when they discuss policy, especially when it comes to wealth redistribution.
Oh, absolutely. Our sources looked at research done in countries with high inequality, Brazil, South Africa, Uruguay, to see how elite perceptions influence their willingness to support aid for the poor.
And what did they find?
What's so fascinating is that the elites in these highly unequal societies, they weren't necessarily oblivious to the problems of poverty. They acknowledged that poverty caused negative externalities that affected them directly, like increased violence or crime.
Okay, so they saw the problem.
They saw the problem.
Yeah.
But their support for redistributive policies was substantially reduced if they perceived the poor themselves in a negative moral or intellectual light.
They focused on perceived character flaws instead of structural solutions.
Precisely. They characterized the poor, or the average voter, as a proxy for the poor, as ignorant, irrational, or politically incompetent. In Brazil, a shocking 77% of the elites surveyed described the average voter as ignorant and irrational. This perception made them inherently skeptical about the poor's ability to lift themselves out of poverty, even with government assistance.
Which, of course, justifies reducing that assistance.
Of course. It frames the entire debate as a choice between giving money to rational actors, the wealthy via subsidies, versus irrational actors, the poor via social programs.
This psychological framework is then reinforced and really weaponized politically through racialization and moral judgment. Which brings us to probably the most infamous political trope in modern American history, the welfare queen.
The history here is just, it's so deeply rooted. Historically, the distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor has been consistently racialized to maintain social hierarchies. Poor black persons have typically been situated on the undeserving side of that binary, and that pattern helps justify withdrawing public support and refusing to raise the standard of living for all citizens.
And this trope was amplified nationally by Ronald Reagan in his 1976 presidential campaign. He used the specific, highly sensationalized case of a woman named Linda Taylor in Chicago.
Yes, Reagan repeatedly claimed she used 80 aliases and collected $150,000 tax-free annually by exploiting the welfare system.
So how did this one case become so powerful?
The political framing of Linda Taylor, who was born Martha Miller and used dozens of identities, leading a very complicated life, is critical. After Reagan's speeches, she became the national symbol of welfare fraud. And critically, she had to be black in the public imagination, even though she often presented as white.
And the prosecutors.
The prosecutors deliberately focused on the welfare fraud charge. It was politically useful for advancing this narrative of government excess, even though she was also suspected of much more serious crimes: murder, kidnapping, human trafficking.
So the welfare fraud was the useful story.
It was the useful story. And the narrative successfully racialized the image of the person draining public resources, even though, factually, most welfare and SNAP recipients are white. Reagan's rhetoric had the effect of morally marking millions of America's poorest people as potential scoundrels.
It fostered this belief that welfare fraud was a nationwide, uncontrollable epidemic.
Right. When the actual cost of this fraud, by the way, is statistically very low, typically less than 1% of program expenditures.
And we see this myth it persists today, doesn't it? It just mutates with new technology, but it targets the same demographics.
Absolutely. We now see this moralizing narrative showing up in fake viral videos, often using AI-generated black women who are claiming to exploit SNP benefits with false quotes like, "I get over $2,500 a month in stamps. I sell them for cash."
And these are completely fabricated.
Entirely fabricated propaganda. And they're then amplified by mainstream outlets and social media, directly reigniting that same Linda Taylor stereotype.
It's the ultimate irony of moral judgment when you contrast the scrutiny, isn't it?
It is.
We're talking about a narrative that makes a poor black woman the scapegoat for draining public resources through maybe a few $1,000s in fraud. Yet, as our sources point out, this happens while wealthy politicians are criticized for using government jets for private trips or relocating onto military bases that are funded entirely by taxpayers.
The scapegoat for government waste is almost always the individual poor person, never the elite actor. And the blame doesn't stop at fraud. Commentators frequently chastise the poor for their short-sighted private spending decisions.
Right, zeroing in on vices as proof of their undeserving nature. There was a particularly harsh and widely publicized column that argued that if the poorest families globally spent less on what they aggressively termed wine, cigarettes, and prostitutes,
Wow.
expenditures that were cited at 3 to 8% of income in surveyed countries, then their children's prospects would be dramatically transformed. The moral failing here is that the poor are extravagant, wasteful, and have fundamentally misplaced priorities.
But a critical analysis of the data cited reveals that this argument is just. It's grossly misleading and highly moralistic.
How so?
When you look at the actual budgets of the poor, the overwhelming majority of their money goes towards a single necessity: food.
Just food.
In the 13 countries that were surveyed for that research, between 56 and 78% of the poor's money goes just toward food. That leaves very, very little for any kind of frivolity.
So the idea that a small reallocation of 3 to 8% of their income from vices could magically transform their children's prospects it's just mathematically and economically impossible.
It is. And furthermore, when you compare the overall averages, spending on education 2.7% overall was actually comparable to or even greater than spending on alcohol and tobacco, which was 3% overall.
That's a crucial detail.
It is. For example, the column aggressively criticized Mexicans for spending 8.1% on vices, but they were simultaneously spending 6.9% on education. This suggests that the claim is not based on budgetary reality at all. It's a deliberate, moralistic judgment designed to shift blame away from systemic failures and onto individual character.
It's the classic move.
It's the classic move.
Oh,
Blame the victim's behavior, their moral failing, their ignorance, their vice, to avoid addressing the systemic reality that traps them.
that denial of structural reality brings us directly to a revolutionary modern understanding of poverty, one that fundamentally challenges that poor decisions cause poverty myth.
Right.
Instead, new research is suggesting that poverty causes poor decisions because it acts as a constant, crushing cognitive burden.
This is truly where the deep dive into the source material shifts the entire political debate. New research, particularly a landmark 2013 article published in the journal Science, provides empirical, laboratory-based evidence that poverty depletes mental capacity.
So it reframes the whole discussion from morality to neurology.
To neurology, exactly.
How does that actually work? I mean, what does scarcity do to the brain?
The researchers demonstrated that the combination of high anxiety and monetary stress doesn't just make you sad or frustrated. It actively captures attention, triggers intrusive thoughts, and reduces cognitive resources.
So it's like a tax on your brain power.
Think of your mind as a computer with a limited amount of RAM, or random access memory, that's dedicated to complex tasks like planning, budgeting, or impulse control.
Okay.
Poverty is like a massive, constantly running software program. That background worry about rent, about food, about childcare, that is consuming most of that cognitive RAM.
Right.
Being constantly preoccupied with scarcity leaves fewer cognitive resources available for the rational guidance of choices and actions. This state is called scarcity mindset.
So the stress of poverty makes you functionally less intelligent or less capable of decision-making, even if your innate intellectual ability is high. It's situational,
Yeah.
not congenital.
Exactly. And this research is political dynamite because it directly puts the lie to that popular myth that the poor are disadvantaged because they are congenitally lazy or less intelligent.
Which was the really problematic, controversial argument put forth by works like the Bell Curve in the 90s.
Yes, which tried to link economic disparity to inherent differences in heredity and IQ. The Science article suggests that any statistical difference in performance is not a reflection of inherent intellectual ability, but rather the high levels of long-term stress that reduce a person's ability to develop and apply their cognitive strengths.
So poverty isn't just a lack of money.
It's a persistent state of high, exhausting mental taxation.
Understanding this cognitive drain has led to some specific policy implications. Researchers are now talking about being aware of the cognitive tax.
Right. The idea is that policymakers must be extremely careful not to impose additional unnecessary cognitive taxes on the poor.
Can you give me a real-world example of that?
Sure. Imagine a single mother has to spend 2 hours figuring out how to fill out a 15-page, jargon-filled application for $200 in emergency aid. She has to track down documents, navigate a broken website, wait on hold.
Okay.
That complexity is effectively draining her mental battery. It's consuming the limited cognitive resources she might have needed later that day to make a sound decision about a new job application or a major purchase.
It's an institutional structure that actively makes people less capable of helping themselves.
It is. This cognitive tax includes complex forms, lengthy, intimidating interviews, constantly changing rules. The argument is that policy demands should ideally be simplified and timed for periods when stress is momentarily lower. For instance, right after they receive periodic income, before the anxiety about running out of money kicks in again.
But the immediate policy recommendations we see, like just reducing paperwork, seem, I don't know, completely insufficient when you compare them to the profound damage that poverty does to the brain and decision-making over the long term.
And that's what's fascinating here. The authors of that groundbreaking Science article, while revealing the enormous systemic damage that poverty does, they chose to sidestep the full political implications of their own data by primarily focusing on these minor administrative fixes.
Instead of the big picture.
Right. Society has a profound moral and economic obligation to deal with the core damage of poverty itself, to reduce the state of scarcity, not just offer minor fixes like reducing forms or making processes a little bit easier to navigate.
This prevailing emphasis on fixing the individual rather than fixing the structure also shows up really strongly in the popularity of individualized solutions. I'm thinking specifically about mandatory financial literacy programs.
Hmm.
They're often marketed as the key to breaking the generational cycle of poverty.
Financial literacy is certainly valuable knowledge, there's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
But these programs are utterly insufficient as a salve for poverty, which, as we've established, is fundamentally a systemic problem. It's rooted in a lack of economic opportunity and resources.
But what do they actually do?
At best, they teach exploited people how to individually navigate a predatory economy, how to use a checking account, or understand a credit card contract. And that's a fine educational project, but it is not an anti-poverty strategy.
It feels a little bit like giving swimming lessons to people whose boat is sinking and then blaming them for drowning when they can't swim fast enough to reach the shore.
That's a great analogy.
Hmm.
The priority should be fixing the sinking boat.
And it's crucial to note who gets targeted by these programs.
Well, right. These paternalistic financial literacy programs primarily target the most exploited. Low-income families, youth, sometimes debt-burdened students, affluent people, even the financially frivolous ones, are not being sold mandatory corporate-sponsored booklets on budgeting.
No.
They're not facing federal policies that dictate their spending choices. This just reinforces the idea that poverty is a personal flaw that needs correction through moral instruction, rather than a failure of the labor market.
And this whole bootstraps argument often relies on another stubborn stereotype, the myth that all poor people are just refusing to work or are universally unemployed.
We really need to set the record straight on this unemployed poor myth because the data just speaks volumes about the structural problem.
So what does it say?
Many poor people are working. For instance, in 2010, 7% of working-age people who worked some or all of the year were still living in poverty.
They were working and they were still poor.
Yes. Look at food assistance. 30% of households receiving food assistance had earnings. 41% lived in a household where at least one person was earning money. Nearly a quarter, over 21%, of non-elderly adult food stamp recipients were employed. They are the working poor.
This reveals a critical structural issue that no amount of financial literacy or grit can fix. The problem isn't a refusal to work, it's a labor market that is failing to provide fair value.
Exactly. The economy has polarized. It's failing to provide enough middle-skill, middle-wage jobs that can pay a family wage. It's forcing people into low-wage service and precarious gig jobs that do not pay a living wage, even if two family members hold them.
So when you have politicians from both parties repeating the mantra that world-class education is the only path to a good job.
The inescapable implication is that essential workers, the farm workers, the retail staff, the housekeepers, the childcare laborers, that they do not deserve to earn enough money to sustain their families. It shifts the blame from the failure of wage policy to the workers' lack of skills. The core economic problem is not a deficit of character among the poor, but a deficit of good-paying jobs in the market.
Now, we need to flip the lens entirely. We've established that the poor are intensely scrutinized, judged, and shamed for receiving meager, dignity-destroying government assistance. But the whole conversation over welfare ignores the far, far greater scale of subsidies going to the wealthy and corporations.
This is where we make the invisible government handouts visible. While politicians wage these intense rhetorical wars over cutting social programs for low-income citizens, the far greater American subsidies, hundreds of billions of dollars annually, go to millionaires and major industries. This is the true American welfare state.
Okay, let's start with the tax code because that's where the biggest handouts are often hidden.
Yes.
We often hear about the enormous cost of programs like Medicare and Medicaid, and they are certainly high. But our sources show that the cost of federal income tax expenditures, things that function as subsidies delivered through reduced taxes rather than a check, goes almost entirely to the wealthiest Americans.
Tax expenditures are government spending that just happens through the tax code. We're talking about things like the deduction for home mortgage interest, reduced rates on capital gains, interest, and dividend exclusions.
And these programs disproportionately benefit the rich. The home mortgage interest deduction, for example. It's often touted as helping the middle class, but it mostly benefits people who can afford very large mortgages.
Right. If you have a $50,000 mortgage, the deduction might save you a few $100s. If you have a $5 million mortgage, it saves you tens of thousands of dollars.
And the overall scale is just staggering. The cost of those income tax expenditures, which go almost entirely to the wealthiest 13.7% of filers, was estimated to be higher than the combined cost of Medicare and Medicaid.
Think about that for a second. It's essentially welfare for the well-off, but it's invisible to the public. It feels like you just kept your money rather than receiving a check, which feels like dependency,
And then there's corporate welfare.
which involves direct grants, below-market insurance, loans, trade protection, and these highly specialized, complex special interest tax loopholes.
And this corporate welfare state became truly entrenched in the federal budget back in the 1920s and 30s.
Yes. Look at farm subsidies. President Herbert Hoover's Federal Farm Board, established in 1929, had a $500 million authorization to subsidize agricultural cooperatives, to stockpile commodities and raise prices.
And this was during the Depression.
Yes. Even as many Americans were starving during the Depression, the government was wasting taxpayer money, distorting markets, and ultimately failing to solve the farm crisis. But policymakers didn't learn the lesson. Today, the system continues. Most of the roughly $30 billion in annual federal farm subsidies goes to large corporate-style farms, often publicly traded companies.
Not the struggling small family operations that are always the rationale for the program.
Not at all.
And the size and scope of corporate subsidies have only grown sharply in recent years, especially with major legislation passed under both political parties.
Indeed. Our sources estimate total federal budget corporate welfare spending at an astonishing $181 billion annually. And that figure has soared recently.
The Jacks.
We saw enormous injections of public capital through acts like the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021, the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022, and the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. These bills represent massive targeted industrial policy where the government is functionally picking winners and losers in the economy.
Okay, let's look at some specific industries to really grasp the cost. How about pharmaceuticals? Big pharma welfare.
The U.S. government effectively grants enormous monopolies and price control freedoms to drug manufacturers. And consequently, U.S. prices for prescription drugs are nearly 3 times as high as in other OECD countries.
And that's not because development costs are 3 times higher?
No, it's due to policy. For example, a hepatitis C treatment like Sovaldi, when it was launched, cost $84,000 for a 12-week course in the U.S.
Wow.
In comparison, that same treatment costs less than $1,000 in India, where generics were manufactured. This difference is an effective subsidy on the backs of American consumers and taxpayers.
And insulin prices.
Insulin prices in the U.S., which are essential for life, were nearly 10 times higher than in other comparable countries in 2022. That profit margin is a direct result of invisible corporate welfare policy.
And in the tech and manufacturing sectors, we see this strange circular dependency where the money flows out of the government and right back into corporate hands, often through grants.
Right. Companies like Intel, for example, they pay substantial taxes, but then they receive billions of dollars back through government grants to build new facilities.
So the money goes out of the tax system and straight back into their bank account.
Exactly. The only real beneficiaries of that transaction, besides the corporation itself, are the Washington lobbyists, the lawyers, and the legislators who facilitated the grant in the first place.
So it disadvantages competitors.
When you realize that the government offering IBM a $5 million research grant disadvantages every other American firm that has to compete with IBM because the rest of us have to pay the taxes or underwrite the debt for that check, the logic of corporate welfare becomes clear. It benefits the highly connected recipient, but it fundamentally distorts the general economy and costs the taxpayer.
And then there are the massive subsidies that are wrapped up in good intentions, like those for electric vehicles or EVs. Our sources point out that these have complex, unacknowledged systemic costs.
Right. EV subsidies, while they're aiming for climate goals, they come with these profound environmental and safety contradictions.
How so?
Well, despite the massive push for electrification, almost 60% of the electricity consumed by EVs in the U.S. is still produced by natural gas and coal-fired plants. So you're just shifting the emission source from the tailpipe to the power plant.
And there are also mechanical and safety concerns stemming from the vehicle's weight.
Precisely. EVs are significantly heavier, at least 20% heavier than comparable gas-powered vehicles.
Right.
Because of the battery packs. This increased weight causes faster tire wear, which emits greater amounts of particulate matter, a significant pollution concern that's often overlooked.
And in accidents.
More worryingly, one study found that being hit by a vehicle that's 1,000 pounds heavier results in a 47% increase in fatality probability for the other vehicle's occupants. These heavier vehicles pose greater safety risks to everyone else on the road, including pedestrians.
And the battery supply chain itself introduces ethical concerns that are often ignored when we talk about the environmental benefits.
Absolutely. The reliance on lithium-ion batteries means a huge demand for cobalt, with most of it sourced from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, raising serious human rights and child labor concerns in the mining sector.
And recycling.
Lithium batteries are notoriously difficult and costly to recycle. They risk soil and groundwater contamination when they're landfilled. And landfills themselves are experiencing dangerous fires stemming from the disposal of these batteries. Yet the massive financial subsidies continue despite these very real systemic costs.
It's prioritizing corporate profit and industrial expansion over holistic environmental and ethical concerns.
That's a good way to put it.
And this impulse to bail out corporations or provide monopolies isn't new either. This is an American tradition that predates independence.
Oh yeah. Look at the 1773 Boston Tea Party. It was partly driven by massive public anger toward the monopoly advantages and the effective bailout policy that was given to the financially struggling British East India Company.
And after independence.
Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary, advocated for tariffs and government grants to manufacturing. He even co-founded a manufacturing project in Paterson, New Jersey in 1791 that received monopoly privileges.
And did it work?
No, that project failed due to mismanagement and corruption. But the idea of using government policy to aid elites has been a constant feature of the American economic system.
It's the ultimate political punchline, isn't it?
It is. Both major parties have supported the expansion of corporate welfare. Republicans, despite their consistent claim to be the party of anti-big government and free markets, are repeatedly accused of being the party of the rich because they consistently fail to cut corporate pork.
And instead, they aggressively pass tax cuts that favor corporations and the wealthy.
Exactly. This political hypocrisy reinforces public suspicion. The Democrats often charge that Republicans want to cut food assistance for school children, but won't touch tax breaks for the Fortune 500. And these attacks ring true because corporate handouts are the fundamental antithesis of the free market principles Republicans claim to espouse.
So we have a system where the government is functionally operating two massive, distinct welfare programs.
Two programs.
One that is small, visible, intensely moralized and degrading for the poor, and one that is vast, invisible, normalized, and dignity-enhancing for the wealthy and corporations. That distinction, the moralization of welfare, leads us directly to the policy of degradation. Our sources show that American poverty policies have historically been defined by providing meager assistance conditioned on what they call submission to rituals of degradation.
This is a deep historical trend. It's rooted in the less eligibility principle from the 1848 English Poor Law Commission.
What was that principle?
The core idea was fundamentally punitive. Those surviving on the dole should, by design, not be as well off as the lowest paid laborer. The practical effect of this was ensuring that relief for the poor would never accidentally raise the wage floor for everyone else.
It was designed to keep relief intentionally unpleasant.
Exactly.
And this punitive, work-centric approach was later codified in the U.S. in 1996 with the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. Most people know it as welfare reform.
PRWAR codified what's often called workfarist policy. It extracted work or seeking work in exchange for assistance. It imposed lifetime limits and strict requirements. And this continues the historical trend of identifying certain groups, like able-bodied men and women without dependents, as targets for disciplinary measures regarding programs like SNP benefits.
It reinforces the idea that they're undeserving because of an assumed aversion to work, which then necessitates constant monitoring and punitive measures. And this pervasive idea of deservingness has a devastating effect, not just from the government down, but within the poor community itself. It creates something called intra-class stigma. This sounds like the glue that holds the system of blame in place.
It absolutely is the glue. Intra-class stigma is the intense pressure to prove oneself as a deserving citizen, which then leads to internalized and reproduced class stigmatization among the poor themselves.
How does that play out?
Ethnographic research conducted at places like soup kitchens or welfare offices shows attendees actively judging their peers. They gossip about perceived drug use, inappropriate use of food stamps like buying steak or non-essentials, or a lack of genuine gratitude.
So it's a societal self-policing mechanism. They police each other to ensure they look good to the wider system.
That's precisely it. Recipients will go to great lengths to appear grateful, patient, and not entitled, even when the system is failing them repeatedly. They're forced to engage in tremendous emotional labor.
Wow.
One ethnographic account described a recipient who kept rewriting her story about an SSDI application, constantly extending the expected waiting time because, as she put it, she had to hurry up and wait and always seemed cooperative.
That deep effort to abide by these expected behavioral standards of patience and gratitude, it must limit class solidarity.
It does. It prevents collective action and forces individuals to internalize their despair rather than challenge the structural failures.
So if the system is designed to impose degradation, to consume cognitive resources, and to prevent solidarity, then financial literacy programs and personal advice are just, they're not going to work.
Not on a systemic level.
We have to conclude that poverty is a reflection of how our society is structured, not a reflection of individual choices.
We have to look at the macro processes. The structural transformation of the economy over the last 3 decades, marked by financial deregulation, aggressive anti-unionism, and the decline of middle-wage manufacturing jobs. That is what has driven poverty up and inequality wider.
And when structural aid is actually applied, the effect is immediate and dramatic, proving the point entirely.
We saw this so clearly with the COVID-19 pandemic relief efforts.
Yeah.
I mean, the core surviving programs of the War on Poverty, food stamps, Medicaid, etc., they still lift nearly 30 million people out of poverty every year.
But the pandemic data was really revealing.
It was undeniable. The most revealing data comes from the very recent past. Child poverty doubled in 2022. It doubled after key pandemic aid, specifically the monthly child tax credit, expired.
Doubled. That is not a reflection of millions of parents suddenly becoming financially illiterate overnight.
Not at all. That single massive data point proves, without any question, that poverty levels can increase or decrease rapidly based on structural policy choices, not on individual character flaws or grit. Policy created the poverty. Policy lifted people out of poverty, and the expiration of that policy plunged them right back in.
This raises a really important question. If poverty is primarily a structural problem, not a personal choice or a character flaw, what does true anti-stigma, anti-poverty work look like?
It requires a fundamental cultural and political shift, a shift toward an intersectional coalitional approach. We need to stop viewing stigma as a natural outcome of poverty. It's not. It is socially produced and manufactured by the powerful to shift blame onto individuals and protect the economic status quo.
So what does structural change look like?
True structural change requires designing dignity and anti-stigma out of welfare systems entirely, ensuring that assistance is provided not through rituals of degradation, but with automaticity and respect. It must challenge the prevailing economic logic that insists on endless financial growth and consumerism as the only measures of societal well-being.
That means not just trying to fix the paperwork, but challenging the very belief that certain people are inherently more deserving than others.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We are talking about changing the fundamental beliefs we hold about economic fairness and worthiness, and recognizing that society is stronger when we all thrive, not just when a few manage to climb a rigged ladder. Hashtag tag tag outro.
So this deep dive has shown us that the self-made myth is, well, it's historically fabricated. It rests on a foundation of hidden government subsidies and inherited privilege, not pure grit. We found that the intensive blame placed on the poor is psychologically manufactured through the just world hypothesis and politically weaponized through these persistent racialized tropes like the welfare queen.
And critically, we learned that the true massive dependency in the U.S. rests with that often invisible system of corporate subsidies and tax loopholes that just dwarf the meager assistance offered to the poor.
Right.
Furthermore, poverty itself is a crushing cognitive burden that reduces mental capacity, challenging the very notion that the poor are undeserving because they're irrational or ignorant. The poor are rational actors operating under crushing duress.
Understanding this systemic view, I think, helps liberate us, the learner, from the unnecessary self-blame that comes with the relentless pursuit of the grind set and the rugged individual ideal.
It really does.
Recognizing that we all depend on each other and on the structures around us allows us to stop punishing ourselves for striving and for the attendant isolation that the self-made ideal demands.
And society has a moral and economic obligation to address that structural damage, not just offer individualized palliative solutions like financial literacy. The data on the child tax credit proves that poverty is a policy choice, and that the only way to achieve true anti-poverty work is to design systems that provide support with dignity and challenge the underlying economic inequality.
So we'll leave you with this final provocative thought to mull over. The U.S. has historically shown this immense capacity for generosity on a global scale, abolishing slavery, launching the Marshall Plan to rebuild foreign nations, providing vast foreign disaster aid.
Hmm.
If our national policies were to turn that same sense of generosity, urgency, and humanity toward our own citizens, what fundamental beliefs about the imperative of endless economic growth, the absolute requirement of wage work, and the cultural obsession with consumerism would we have to dismantle first?